much for taking the time to join us this morning for this webinar. So as mentioned, my name is Dr. Megan Weir, and I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Social Impact, UNSW. And I'm also the lead researcher for the Australian Social Progress Index. So before we get started, I would also like to acknowledge that today I'm on Gadigal and Bidjigal land. And one advantage of moving to Zoom meetings this year has meant that I've been able to get more familiar with different countries and custodians where my colleagues and other contacts are living and working. So Isabella, can you introduce yourself and tell us what country or land you're on today?
Thanks, Megan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Isabella Saunders, and I'm a research assistant at CSI, and I've also been one of the primary researchers for the Social Progress Index. Today I'm on Gadigal land, and I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present.
So one of the things that I often reflect on and often say when doing acknowledgement of country, when talking about the Social Progress Index, is that when we talk about and think about progress, it's often with the intent of looking forward to this future that we want. But in order to have a truly progressive society, we also need to be willing to look backwards and see where there have been historical injustices, particularly for First Nations people in Australia, and recognise the ongoing impact that colonisation, including through things like the stolen generations, dispossession of land, and decades of stolen wages, has had on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this day. We can't have a progressive society unless we are willing to confront these uncomfortable histories and disrupt systems that allow marginalisation and disadvantage to continue. So with that, I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, both on the lands where I am today, but also across Australia, including any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today, and also recognise that we are all meeting on land where sovereignty has never been ceded. So first up, for those of you who are less familiar with the Centre for Social Impact, we are a collaboration between the University of New South Wales, the Swinburne University of Technology, and the University of Western Australia. Put broadly, our aim and purpose is to catalyse positive social change. This means taking an honest look at our society, where there are disparities and injustices, and our focus is on equipping communities and organisations with the skills to be able to work together for a more equitable society. A major project that at CSI UNSW we're currently undertaking is called the Amplify Social Impact Project, where we aim to help the for-purpose sector better understand our current society, its needs and ability to respond to social issues. And one of those focuses is on economic inequality and its impact on social progress. So Australia, compared to the rest of the world, has been an undeniably economically successful country. Up until the COVID crisis this year, we had seen continuous growth in our gross domestic product, or GDP, over the last 29 years, including relative stability through the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. This means that we have young people who are completing high school and university and entering the workforce in social conditions where there had only ever been growth in their lifetime. The economy, keeping it strong and making policy decisions that first and foremost centre the economy, remains a strong focus, particularly for our current federal government. When we reflect on last week's budget announcements, for example, spending is largely focused on supporting business and infrastructure to create jobs. Tax cuts to businesses have been passed in order to, and I quote, rebuild our economy and create more jobs by kickstarting activity in the private sector. If we reflect further back to earlier in the year, the government's response to the devastation of the bushfires across Australia and Australia's broader response to climate change has been similar. Any response, first and foremost, must not jeopardise Australia's vibrant and viable economy. This has also been a strong focus both globally and in Australia as governments respond to COVID, where there have been calls to ensure that the economy remains open. But in advocating for this, we need to grapple with the ethical decisions about whether the economy or infection and death rates dictate policy. Australia has done remarkably well overall in its response to COVID by responding quickly with lockdowns and funding primary healthcare, but we are seeing increasingly that policy priorities are reorienting towards the economy. An issue that more people are becoming aware of is that talking about and focusing on Australia's economy and GDP growth can feel kind of off when dealing with the realities of the communities where there are high levels of financial stress, homelessness, or untreated illness. There's an issue if we are only talking about GDP per capita and using that as a sole indication that the needs and circumstances of all communities across Australia are therefore progressive. So how we generate an economy and its flow-on effect also matters. While the economy itself is not a person, it is driven by people within that system. And our work leads us to be critical of assuming that the economy is this benign entity of its own. So during the 20th century, and I think this still continues to this day to a certain extent, there was an assumption that economic development automatically generated social progress. So if GDP per capita was going up, for example, this was evidence of the progressiveness of a society. However, we know that in many instances, economic development doesn't automatically result in social progress. And in some cases, it can even harm social progress. So a relevant example I often think of is the impact of the mining boom, both on the environment in Australia, but also its impact on communities where mining companies have resided for a few years and then left once the resources have been fully mined. Other ways of generating income, such as the exportation of arms and privatization of prisons, undeniably also can have a negative impact on individuals either here or abroad. And this relationship is not necessarily a one-way stream. Sometimes social progress affects economic development. The state of basic education and health in a region could have impacts on how fit and able the workforce is, for example. So in order to truly understand inclusive growth, we need a measure of social progress that is independent of economic measures that we can correlate against the economy, but it also means that our understanding of the society is less muddied by dollar values. So the Amplify Social Impact Project has partnered with international not-for-profit, the Social Progress Imperative, in creating Australia's first Social Progress Index, or the SPI. The SPI has been calculated at a global level since 2013, and it gives us an indication of how countries relative to one another compare on its ability to meet the basic human needs of citizens, enhance and sustain quality of life, and create conditions for all individuals to reach their full potential. It's these three domains of basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity alongside the economy that we believe will lead to truly inclusive growth. An important part of the index is also that in order for social progress overall to improve, each of these domains must improve. There's no one concept that is more important than the other. A fundamental argument then is that when we think about responding to crises such as COVID-19, we can't think of it solely as an economic crisis or only as a health crisis, but instead need to be thinking about how we respond to an intersecting and complex system of economic, health, and social problems. And for a resilient and inclusive recovery, we would want to be hitting each of these four areas to ensure that sustainable building blocks are there to allow us to use the structures of an inclusive economy and society to also better prepare us to respond to crises in the future.
So the Social Progress Index offers us an accessible and actionable assessment of the health of society that is completely independent of economic measures. It's a framework that aims to capture not just present challenges and today's priorities, but also the challenges that countries or regions will face as their economic prosperity rises. The index reveals relative performance compared to a country or region's economic peers, and then assesses their success in turning economic progress into improved social outcomes. It's distinct from other tools in that it only includes social and environmental indicators, and it also just measures outcomes instead of inputs. So this means in the case of Australia, for example, we were more interested in the proportion of children who ended up in preschool rather than how much money was spent on a campaign to enrol more children in preschool, for example. So the index offers what we call universally important questions. So these are concerns that are relevant to any country, state, or territory, and any indicator that we included needed to be aimed at addressing one of these questions. So over the last 18 months, we've been going through the process of consultation with academics, members of the for-purpose sector, businesses invested in the Sustainable Development Goals, and also local government to really think about what we could use as indicators to best answer these questions for Australia. So it wasn't just a question of what indicators we should include, but it was also a process of working out what data was actually available because we needed to use data sources and indicators that were being consistently measured across all 8 states and territories, and then also indicators that were updated annually. So this ended up turning into a bigger challenge than we initially expected. So the process of identifying the indicators that are available and then setting the limits of what we thought would be the best and the worst case scenario for Australia's social progress led us to this here. So this image shows how Australia's states and territories are performing relative to one another on overall social progress. It is important to make clear that these scores are how socially progressive the society and its policies are, not the people that live there. So we were able to calculate the SPI scores between 2015 and 2018 annually. And then we also were able to rank the states and territories on both overall social progress, but then also on each domain and component within the SPI framework. So as a brief overview, between 2015 and 2018, we did see some consistent trends. So ACT was consistently the #1 region each year, and Western Australia and Northern Territory consistently placed 7th and 8th respectively. Also, just to briefly note, these scores are for the state or territory as a whole. So in future, we will hopefully be able to calculate an index that reflects things like remoteness, cultural and religious differences, or experiences of people with a disability, for example. So each day this week during this series of webinars, we're focusing on a different state or territory and exploring their SPI scores. So as mentioned, today is Queensland. We're going to do a deep dive into the scorecards, where the state ranked compared to other states and territories. We've also mapped each state's performance to their policy responses to COVID to see where there are existing vulnerabilities in the state, and then how the state government responded during the pandemic. We will also cover how the SPI relates to the Sustainable Development Goals and how different regions are progressing towards achieving those goals. So to understand these scorecards a bit better, we'll also zero in on some of the specific indicators that we use to make up the SPI scores, and then talk about what we can take away from both the index findings, but also where we see need for improvement in relation to the SDGs. So when we think about Queensland, how would you describe it? Feel free to put in the chat there some of the words that you might describe, some of the words you might use to describe the state or community where you live, or just your general perception of Queensland. So we did a quick whip around our office and came up with a couple of these descriptors. So, some people said the Sunshine State, or Queensland is quite well known for its tourism, also its beaches and reefs. So these are the kind of general impressions that we have as outsiders to these states. And it has been a really interesting process of aligning these kind of general perceptions that we have of a state against then the scores and the data that we saw coming out of the SPI. So when we look at how Queensland performed on the most recent SPI, it ranked 6th on overall social progress, meaning that it was on the lower end of social progress relative to other states and territories across Australia. If we break it down across the components, Queensland scored higher for basic human needs involving access to healthcare and water and sanitation. And it had lower scores for opportunity, particularly in inclusiveness and access to advanced education. So we can definitely use these base scores as an indicator of where there needs to be targeted investment and improvement.
But the other thing that we can layer to this analysis is an understanding of how an individual state or territory is performing in components of social progress relative to its economic peers. This is relevant because of this two-way stream of economic and social progress that I talked about earlier. It's not reasonable for us to assume that less wealthy jurisdictions can commit the same resources to policy as wealthier areas. So these scorecards help us to understand how a state or territory is performing on elements of social progress relative to its 4 closest states or territories in terms of its gross state product per capita, which is our more localized version of GDP. The shading on the scorecard indicates performance. So yellow indicates an SPI component within 1 standard deviation of its peers, and it indicates that they're performing within an expected range. Green is a score that is greater than 1 standard deviation and indicates performance that is better than expected. And red is for a score that is more than 1 standard deviation worse and indicates performance is worse than expected. So it's not possible for every state with their scorecards to have or greens, and that's not what we should be aiming for. But ideally, we would want to be getting to a point where all scorecards for all states and territories are showing as yellow. So for Queensland, as Isabella mentioned, there were lower scores for inclusiveness and access to higher education. And we can see that Queensland is performing worse than its peers in these two components. However, if we also look at the basic human needs domain, which included some of Queensland's highest scoring components, they're actually performing worse than expected on personal safety, as well as nutrition, basic medical care, and water and sanitation. Overall, Queensland is looking pretty good for meeting the foundations of well-being, and it's performing better than its peers on environmental quality. However, if we look at overall social progress, Queensland is currently slightly performing worse than expected. So we released the index in February this year with this intention of engaging with individual state and territory governments to discuss how the SPI can be used as a way of determining policy priorities and addressing areas of social progress that were found to be particular vulnerabilities based on their scores. But like a lot of things this year, the plan got interrupted when COVID became a bigger threat in Australia and we shifted to working remotely, as well as government and university priorities significantly shifting in a short period of time. One thing that we did notice, however, is that when there's continuous policies being announced in response to COVID, it can be quite difficult understanding and interpreting these policies and stimulus packages when they're being released almost daily. And what we actually found was that the SPI framework became a really useful way of understanding and interpreting what was receiving attention and was being understood as the big issues of COVID. So when we did our analysis, we made two assumptions that we want to flag. The first is that where a government chooses to spend its money is indicative of where it places its priorities. And the second is that we should conservatively expect that without targeted policy attention, pre-existing inequities are likely to deepen when going into a period of crisis such as a pandemic. What we did then was look at each policy or stimulus package announced by both federal and state and federal governments and judged whether that policy fit within a particular component of the social progress index or whether it was a measure that was focused only on the economy or employment. This mapping could go both ways. So policies could be aiming to target a particular social issue, such as increased funding for homelessness services, but also on-the-spot fines have potential risks for personal rights if they are handed out in ways that target particular groups of people that have historically been disproportionately policed. So we'd note here that this analysis isn't intended to reveal how well a government is responding to COVID, but instead gives us an insight into where policy priorities are being concentrated or require more attention. So the analysis that we're talking through here is based on a fact sheet that we published originally in July this year and was updated last week to reflect current policies. And I believe Nick is going to post a link to the fact sheet in the chat. So this is a living document and we're updating it about fortnightly at this stage with new policies as they're being announced.
So in looking at Queensland's COVID response, you can see here that it had possibly one of the broadest social progress and economic responses of the jurisdictions. So while there has been a strong economic recovery plan put in place, there has also been significant investment in acute healthcare, as well as funding boosts for family and domestic violence, support for international students, and also a loans package for universities, which are all areas of social progress that have previously been underperforming in Queensland. So this is the kind of response that we think is ideal, in that policies are responding to COVID as an economic issue, but there is also a health and a social focus. So we do note, however, that similar to other states and territories, there is investment to try and drive further mining as a way of boosting the economy. We suggest it is unwise to be looking to sacrifice an element of social progress, such as environmental quality, to be able to boost economic progress. So also a new application of the Australian SPI that we can show today is using the Australian SPI scores to give us an indication of how each state and territory is progressing towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs. So for those not familiar with the SDGs, they are a set of 17 integrated goals that were adapted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and also ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. So they were created as a replacement to the Millennium Development Goals that initially set out to respond to and tackle global indignity and poverty. So Australia is a signatory to the goals. However, there are two recognised issues in Australia that are first, much of the focus has been on Australia assisting in implementing the goals in developing countries, particularly in the Pacific region, but there has been little recognition given to the fact that we also need to be ensuring that the goals are being met within Australia. Secondly, there's also no one clear strategy towards measuring or reporting on goal attainment. So as a consequence, the goals can be seen as something that people can get behind, but there is little in the way of measurement that's actually being put in place to track how Australia is actually progressing towards meeting those goals. So the Social Progress Index framework was developed with the SDGs in mind, so that the components can be used to give us an insight into how each state and territory is progressing on the SDGs using a proxy measure.
And when we say proxy, we do so recognising that these scorecard indicators are based on what data is available and was appropriate for the SPI methodology. And these scores are derived by calculating the average of all the component scores that were judged to contribute to a particular goal. However, this is definitely a first in terms of getting a comparative measure of how states and territories are progressing towards achieving the goals. And similar to the economic peer scorecards, can give us an insight into areas where there is more attention needed as a matter of policy priority. There's a lot to take in on these scorecards, and I know that for a lot of you, these are probably showing up as quite small. So instead, what Isabella is going to do is dive into some of the highest scoring and lowest scoring goals and talk about what this means when aiming for sustainable social progress.
So two of the highest scoring goals for Queensland were goals 6 and 2. So goal 6 is clean water and sanitation. So that aims to ensure that there is available and sustained water management and sanitation for everyone. And goal 2 is zero hunger. So that's the goal that aims to end hunger and achieve food security, as well as improving sustainable agricultural practices. So the way that we created proxy scores for the SDG clean water and sanitation primarily centred around the SPI components of water and sanitation, and then also some environmental quality indicators. In particular, in Queensland, the concentrations of sulfur dioxide as an indicator of air quality and the frequency of water interruptions on properties were indicators where Queensland was performing well and actually had scores that were substantially better than their economic peers. I would note here, however, that environmental indicators across Australia were a little bit complicated. So when we were searching for nationally consistent indicators and what we could use to meaningfully contribute to understandings of environmental quality, we actually found that many states hadn't been updating their air quality index publicly in the timeframe that we were looking for, although Queensland actually was one of the states that did regularly update their air quality. This meant that we needed to substitute in scores for some states. So this also highlights the importance of consistent measurement, particularly if we're wanting to understand how we're progressing towards achieving the SDGs. So it is difficult to get a good understanding of where there needs to be progress if we don't actually have the data to direct our attentions. And then also looking at goal 2 there, Queensland also scored quite well on the components looking at access to nutrition and basic medical care, and also health and wellness. So for achieving zero hunger, indicators that could be used to understand how Queensland is going on this goal is through looking at both infant mortality and premature mortality rates, as well as community mental health treatment. So remember that the SPI is measured based on outcome indicators. So when thinking about these scores, we're considering whether the indicators are possible outcomes of, for example, a lack of adequate nutrition. So now looking at the lowest scoring goals. So for Queensland, these were goals 9 and goal 4. So 9 is the goal that looks at developing quality, reliable, sustainable and resilient infrastructure with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. And goal 4 focuses on ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education. So at the moment, these are the 2 SDG goals that we would suggest Queensland needs to be paying targeted attention to based on its SPI scores. So if we're looking at how Queensland is faring at achieving industry innovation and infrastructure, we looked at components that included access to advanced education and also communications. And Queensland scored lower on indicators such as the rate of young people not in employment, education or training, as well as scoring lower on digital access and affordability. So also linked to education was Queensland's lower score in achieving quality and inclusive education. So using components for access to basic knowledge and also access to advanced education to create this score, we can see that specific indicators where Queensland is underperforming are in high school retention rates, access to early childhood education, and also post-high school enrolment. So in looking at these two goals together, it is indicative that Queensland's priorities should be focused primarily around education, so access to both advanced and basic education, and also the state's ability to provide equitable access to information and communications. So in Queensland's case, these areas for improvement are also likely to be influenced by the proportion of the state that is regional or remote, which can impact on access to some of these services that are easier to access in urban or regional areas.
So an important thing to talk about with the index scores and scorecards is to acknowledge and recognise that there is this inherent tension that kind of exists between perceptions and data. So one thing that we notice when asking around the office and thinking ourselves about our perceptions of state and territory is that we're often finding that we're actually describing a capital city or well-known areas, and that perception doesn't necessarily reflect the experience of the entire state and territory. So for me, having Queensland as my home state, growing up in the Sunshine Coast and then moving down to Brisbane, my understanding of Queensland is very much influenced by my experience living in those areas, but I don't know what it's like living in Rockhampton or Mount Isa, for example. And so this links to a second point, that location matters. Due to data availability at this stage, we were only able to calculate an Australian SPI at the state territory level, which inevitably leads to what we call a smoothing effect. So you're seeing averages across the entire jurisdiction, rather than being able to detect nuance that exists between metro and remote areas. This is a definite goal that we have with the SPI moving forward, and that's to invest in data collection and measurement so we can start seeing how different local communities across Australia are faring on social progress. The other thing to note with the SPI scores is that each score is how a jurisdiction is performing relative to all other states and territories in Australia. So this means that there might be instances where there is areas for improvement in Queensland's environmental quality, for example, but at the moment there are other jurisdictions that are having greater issues in addressing its environment. Another important point for me that I want to express is that we often talk about data as if it's this apolitical or neutral tool, but what we measure and how we measure it actually really matters. If we don't measure the impact of a social problem, it's really easy to say that it doesn't exist. And similarly, how we phrase a survey question or the way that we present data contributes to particular narratives and interpretations, which then guides policy and decision making. So I'm definitely not saying that the SPI is not part and doesn't contribute to this, but instead I'm encouraging in myself and also anyone who is using and talking about the SPI to also be willing to critique how it is that we collect data, and through discussion, identify priorities or gaps in data collection and advocate for that to change in the future. And finally, an SPI score is an indication of the socially progressiveness of the policies and structures within Queensland, not the people living within it. So it's also the case that individual lived experience may be vastly different to the picture that is being painted by the SPI scores. And we don't want to invalidate those experiences, but instead it's our hope that we can use the SPI framework as a way of understanding how basic needs and foundations for well-being and opportunity are not being met, and together work towards solutions for better policy and decision making in the future.
So to sum up for Queensland, if we're looking at where there is cause for celebration, both from the SPI and in the SDG scorecards, Queensland is performing well on environmental indicators, and it also scores well on indicators that could contribute to reduced food insecurity and malnutrition. It also had one of the most across-the-board COVID responses, particularly in adding policies that addressed areas of current underperformance. So this was seen especially in acute hospital care funding, as well as funding support for family and domestic violence services, and it also had the highest amount of financial support for universities across Australia. However, when we consider the scorecards and SDG progress, we also see the need to focus on basic needs such as health, as well as access to information and communication. So this was a substantial area of underperformance for Queensland, and we also need to consider how the impact of that underperformance in one area of social progress, such as access to information and communication, can then have flow-on effects to other areas of social progress, such as the ability to access both basic and advanced education. So as we mentioned earlier, the SPI framework isn't intended to be considered as siloed issues or focuses, but instead, decision-making needs to consider how these components of overall social progress work in tandem to be able to improve access and equity for everyone. So Queensland's overall social progress score and ranking across the years between 2015 and 2018 was between 4th and 6th across the years. So that is likely influenced by a high performance in some components and then poorer performance in others. But as we mentioned earlier, for overall improvement in social progress, all components must improve.
So we want the SBI to be a tool that can help inform better policy. As I've mentioned, it can function as a tool that gives insight into where there are needs of social progress that are flourishing for particular jurisdictions. And by using a standardised measure, we can be looking where states and territories can be compared, and we can better demonstrate where outcomes are quantifiably improving societies. We believe that everyone can find a component within the SPI framework that represents their cause. So if you're a Minister for Education, for example, looking at access to both basic and advanced educations in Australia should help identify where there are opportunities for development. It also encourages collaboration. So we would want this to be a tool that can help governments partner with the not-for-profit and for-purpose sector to partner on shared causes as represented by components of the index, and to help identify opportunities to work together to achieve common goals. The first Australian Social Progress Index provides the beginning of a conversation about how we could measure social progress across Australia. As a first step, it is a tool that is using the best available data to demonstrate the extent to which basic human needs, foundations of wellbeing, and opportunity are playing out across Australia's states and territories. It helps us to shift our attention away solely from economic indicators as measures of progress, but instead helps us to start talking about progress in terms of inclusive growth. Looking into the future, there are lots of ways that we can use the Social Progress Index to look deeper into Australia's progress to achieving these basic human needs and foundations of wellbeing and opportunity. At a more local level, we could calculate a sub-state social progress index, for example, by focusing only on Queensland, but drilling down to more granular data and also creating a framework that best reflects how Queensland thinks about and defines progress. Ideally, in the future, we would love to be able to create a national social progress index that goes down to the local government area, which would allow us to compare the scores across these smaller regions and provide greater insight into where exactly in Australia things are progressing well and where they're not, and on which components. And in particular, it would allow us to compare between metro and rural areas, which we know can differ greatly in their levels of social progress, but unfortunately at this stage cannot be disaggregated for our current Australian Social Progress Index. So while this lack of data at this level currently makes calculating a local government index difficult, another option is to also create a framework only. So this was actually done in Reykjavik in Iceland. And through a process of community consultation, we would map different indicators that align to the social progress components, but aren't necessarily currently being collected consistently across the country. We see community engagement as a really important factor for each of these opportunities, where we would want to make sure that we're including a variety of community voices on what social progress means to them, what is important, and where we are planning to go as a society. And that's where these webinars are really important for us as well, to kind of be communicating the Social Progress Index and to be talking about what's next. And so we really welcome any questions at this point, and also just staying in touch with us with any feedback you might have. So that's basically leaving us a lot of time for questions and answers now. So I might pass back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks, Isa, for that. That was a great presentation. A couple of questions have come through to me privately through the chat. The first one being, and it's quite a popular one, I think, from these presentations, that you mentioned some of the indicators aren't measured because of a lack of consistent data. Is CSI aware of anyone doing anything about this, or is CSI advocating for better data, given what we found?
Would you like to go, Isabella? Or
yeah, sure. Well, we're definitely seeing the SPI as also a tool to advocate for better data collection. It's definitely something that we would love to see in the future, and also we're always open to consultation with or advice from people who have ideas about where data is already being collected and where it is available that we might not already be aware of. But then on the other end of that, we really also are looking for opportunities to be able to collect that data. So yeah, that is something that we're super keen on. Do you have anything to add to that, Megan?
I think I would add that sort of in the process of devising the framework for the Social Progress Index, we looked at over 450 potential data sources and indicators. So we've got a pretty good understanding of at this stage of what data is being collected. There's definitely things that we don't know, but we got a sense of, for example, the Victorian Environmental Protection Agency is doing some really great work around, recycling and waste management. And so rather than us kind of advocating that CSI are the ones that start collecting it, can we then be sort of building on that relationship and saying, well, the EPA is doing this really well. What can we do to be extrapolating that and collecting that at a national level? So rather than us trying to reinvent the wheel, we want to be definitely sort of supporting and bringing attention to where there are already people that are collecting really good data, but they just might need support in boosted sample numbers, for example, or just being collected across multiple states and territories.
Got it. Thank you. A question from me, because I love it when you guys answer this one, is what was the most surprising or unexpected result for you?
I think for me, just kind of, we spoke a little bit about the lack of, and even it came up again, it's just a very relevant thing, is the lack of environmental data that we found across the country. And as Megan said, there are some states that are doing some really good work in collecting some environmental data, but for the SPI, we did need data that was being collected consistently and rigorously in every single state and territory. So I think for Queensland in particular, I found that quite surprising, and also like a pretty big concern, I suppose, in terms of Queensland, because, that's something where marine biodiversity, like a data source on that would have been really useful, especially considering, the trends that we've been seeing with the Great Barrier Reef. So unfortunately, we couldn't find any data that was being collected across the country that looked at ocean life or biodiversity, in that sense. So I think that was something that I had probably before doing this and before looking for data had assumed that there probably was more data out there. But it goes back to Megan's point that she said earlier about data being political as well, and what is being measured matters. And particularly in terms of climate action, there's, everyone's speaking about the issues that that's having on the Great Barrier Reef, but if we're not actually doing anything to measure those things at a consistent national level, how much does it really matter?
How much can we advocate for change? Yeah. I think it's been interesting and surprising having kind of my own assumptions or lack of consideration of what social progress looks like in Queensland, being a Queenslander myself. So, this was a framework that I've only come across since moving to New South Wales, and kind of seeing Queensland as being middle of the pack or middle to bottom of the pack in overall social progress, I think probably reflects maybe what the experience of Queensland is, where we kind of truck along a little bit. But also that consideration of, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Brisbane, like anywhere in the kind of southeast is very different to the rest of Queensland. And so I think we need to be careful about not making assumptions that things for people living in Redcliffe, for example, are the same for what is happening for people living in more rural and remote areas of Queensland. So I think that was surprising for me, but also made sense when you kind of look at both policy responses and what sort of the political history of Queensland is.
Thanks. Thanks. Peter has just asked a question in the chat. I'll read it out for you. It's great to see how the SPI can provide insights into a state's standing against the SDGs. I know indicators are a great way to stimulate inquiries and wonder if the SPI data could be compared with subjective assessments of achievement. For example, what would food banks say or have data to further inform the extent of hunger and others on the nutritional value of the food consumed? That's written out in the chat as well if you wanted to have a quick read. It's quite a long one.
That's a really good question, Peter. Thank you for sending it through. I think that's a really good way of, and that's an intention with the SPI, is that it can stimulate further inquiry where, there's a degree of interpretation that needs to go with the scores. I mean, one thing that I'll mention, and I'll do a little plug, and I know some of the team are on the call here today, is linking to the broader Amplify Social Impact project. There's a number of members of the team that are developing what is called Indicator Engine, which is intended for places like food banks to be able to start measuring their outcomes in a consistent way. And that might also have those assessments in terms of being able to, the proportion of clients that are having hunger issues or, the nutritional value of their food. And so if we can start collecting that data better, we can use that to help inform future SPI scores. And so it's really that linking up of that strategy and trying not to have these as sort of initiatives or approaches that are siloed, but instead kind of saying, we need to have an understanding of food bank use and nutritional data to be able to inform us on how we're going on the SDGs and can we be using the SPI. So it's kind of that linking up. But also recognizing that at the moment, there still is that step to go of, having that connection with food banks, for example, to kind of say, here's where the SPI is at. Does it represent what you're seeing? Does it not? And kind of having that ongoing conversation there. That's probably what I'd say to that. Is there anything you'd add, Isabella?
I think the only thing that I would add, just stress the importance that we see it as really important as well to combine those kind of subjective or qualitative or anecdotal experiences, I suppose, of achievement towards these outcomes with then the data that we're seeing in the SPI that is that quantitative analysis. And as Megan said, this whole thing has been a fair bit of interpretation and has been kind of an academic exercise in pulling these things out. So looking at those findings with then a subjective assessment is really important as well.
Thanks.
Peter?
Thanks. Great question. There's one more question from me, and that is, what's next for the SPI?
What's next? I mean, I think it'll be really interesting to see what the 2020 Australian Social Progress Index looks like. We're planning on calculating the 2019-2020 index next year. And this is because sort of delays in data availability and things like that. But also we're starting to have some exciting conversations about the potential to develop more localized social progress indices. So for local councils, for example, but also having some really good discussions about, how is it that other organizations can be helping us in terms of addressing some of those data issues and working kind of a longer term strategy of, if the ideal utopia and that point that we get to for the Australian SPIs, that we've got it at local government areas, what are the steps that we need to follow to get there? And I think, we're starting to have some potentially really exciting conversations about that. And we're also starting to do some briefings with one-on-one briefings with members of the parliament, start getting them across kind of the findings of the SPI. And, there's been interest in how it can be a different way of talking about Australia's progress and where our priorities are, and also particularly the sustainable development goals as well.
Thanks. And Peter just commented, thanks, and great to hear how actively you're addressing the issues that he raised.
Thanks, Peter.
I think if we have no more questions, I think we get a slightly early mark. I don't think, unless you guys have anything else to add.
I don't think so. No.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for being here today. Thanks Megan and Isa for a great presentation, and be sure to check out impact2020.online for more webinars, and a reminder that New South Wales and ACT are being covered at the same time tomorrow. Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.